So when we were looking at the HDR panorama, and in fact this is true with most HDR photos, it does tend to oversaturate some colours, and in particularly greens do tend to get quite oversaturated. So this is a photograph I took when I was up in Scotland. I've called it purest green. I think we can all agree that there's quite a lot of quite green colour in here on the moss in particular, but also the leaf litter on the floor is also quite saturated. Now in Lightroom we do have a saturation slider that we can pull down, which will help desaturate the greens, but it does everything else as well if we do it inside the basic panel. We also have the hue, saturation and luminance panel where we can target particular colours. So we might target the greens and pull the greens down to desaturate. We'll probably target the oranges in here to desaturate those as well. But the downside to this is that this will desaturate greens and oranges and yellows everywhere. If we look at the leaves in the fir trees here in the background, those have also been desaturated. Now yes, I know I've overdone this, but the point I want to try and make is that by using these saturation tools without using any kind of mask is a blunt instrument. It does everything everywhere. So let's just undo those saturation adjustments, and I'm going to send this over to Photoshop. And in Photoshop we have the ability to create some saturation masks. Now we've seen luminosity masks and used them, and luminosity masks are created around the luminosity of the different parts of the image. Saturation masks are based around the saturation of different parts of the image. So I have a set of actions here which will create some saturation masks for me based around here. And so what we've got now is a set of masks in the channels palette. Note this isn't going to work in Photoshop Elements, by the way, where the lighter areas are highly saturated and the darker areas are not. Or if we go to the low saturation, then the light areas are unsaturated and the dark areas are saturated. Now there is a problem with this, which is why I'm not giving you the action just yet, apart from the fact you can't do this in Photoshop Elements. And that problem is that this tends to say that dark areas are saturated as well. Nevertheless, we can still use this. So I'm going to select this mask, so we'll hold down the Control key on the PC, Command key on the Mac, and click on High Saturation 1. Click on RGB, and then we'll add a hue saturation adjustment layer. And this will automatically put the mask on here. But before I do anything with the saturation, I'm going to Alt click on the PC or Option click on the Mac, and then we'll do a levels adjustment on here to actually refine this mask. So we're going to make this quite contrasted. So we're going to get some black blacks and we'll get some white whites. So we'll go with something like that. So now we're targeting the leaf litter and the moss are definitely going to be targeted. Lots of the needles in the fir trees are not being selected, and we'll adjust the background of some of these other trees in a moment. But if we now go back to the hue and saturation layer and I pull down the saturation, so what we're doing, if I actually pull this all the way down, we can see that we've desaturated the leaf litter and the moss, but we haven't desaturated the pine needles. And yes, we've desaturated other parts of the image, but I can just take a black brush and paint those out. So let's do that. So let's get rid of you. Our brush is already selected, we've already got black, so I'll make sure I've got my mask selected, and we'll just paint in here and we can get those back. Now you can see, if I switch this off, if you look at the tree trunks, for example, they're not that saturated. So when they come down a little bit, but not by much. Now we can always get these back just by painting in them. But obviously I've desaturated that far too much. And in actual fact, I wouldn't do a global saturation like that. What I would probably do is just choose the hand tool here and select the colour that I want to desaturate, and just desaturate that and pull that back just a bit. And I might actually also do something with the lightness. And let's do the same thing down here for the leaf litter. And we'll just pull that saturation back just a touch. And that's what saturation masks can do for us. It allows us to target the saturation of the specific tones. So it allows us to target the colours of areas which are saturated, and not that same colour in areas which are not saturated. So that's a saturation mask.